the doctor who saved him, was the daughter he abandoned. The hospital was unusually still for a Thursday afternoon. Outside, the sky hung heavy with unshed rain, and inside, a soft beep of machines and the gentle murmur of shoes on polished floors filled the air with a quiet tension. Dr. Samantha Bennett stood at the end of the hallway in her white coat, her hands tucked into the pockets, a clipboard pressed to her side. She had just signed off on a routine consultation when the intercom crackled. Code blue. Emergency. Incoming. Private wing. Within seconds, everything shifted. Samantha moved like a current, swift, precise, composed. That was who she was now. A woman carved out of control and clarity. She had seen too much to panic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She just moved. The gurney burst through the double doors, surrounded by staff shouting vitals. Male, mid-60s. Cardiac arrest in transit. BP unstable. VFib en route. No family, just a personal aide, name's Charles Whitmore. They wheeled the man into the cardiac suite. Samantha slipped on her gloves without flinching. She looked down at him, and her heart stopped. The world didn't move. The voices blurred. It was him. Older, thinner, but unmistakably him. Charles Whitmore. Her father. Her jaw clenched. Her hands hovered for a breath too long before she dropped into action. She barked instructions with a steadiness that didn't match the storm inside her. One of the leads isn't secure. Fix it. Push another milligram. Clear the line, now. She focused on the body, not the man. Not the man who left a young black woman to raise a child alone. Not the man who chose comfort and social safety over love and responsibility. Not the man whose face haunted the background of a photo her mother never let her keep. She saved him. He survived. And he never once looked at her like he recognized her. 3 days later, Charles was sitting up in his bed in a quiet, high-floor private room. Machines beeped gently around him, monitoring a heart that had barely made it. His assistant was gone for the day. Visitors had been few, mostly people from the company with flowers and briefcases. He felt older than he had in years. Fragile, even. Vulnerable in a way wealth could not protect. When Samantha entered the room to check on him, he smiled faintly. "You," he said, voice raspy. "You're the doctor who handled my case." "I was on shift during your emergency, yes," she replied, checking the monitors. "You saved my life. I did my job." "Well, thank you." She didn't respond. Just wrote in the chart and turned slightly to leave. "Wait. What's your name, doctor?" She paused. "Dr. Samantha Bennett." Charles's smile flickered. "Bennett." Something stirred in him. But it was too faint, too clouded by years of self-preservation. He didn't ask anything else. She left the room, silent as she had come. That night, Samantha drove home with her hands trembling on the wheel. Her mother was in the kitchen when she walked in, tall, poised, stunning in a quiet way that had never needed makeup to be seen. Grace Bennett. A woman who had once worn scrubs, now wore power like perfume. "How was your shift?" Grace asked, not looking up from her tea. "Strange," Samantha replied, removing her coat. "A patient came in today. Cardiac case. White male. Alone. Businessman. Name's Charles Whitmore." Grace's spoon paused halfway to the teacup. "Charles Whitmore," she said, very softly. Samantha nodded. "He's recovering. Doesn't know who I am." Grace exhaled. Sat down. "So it's come full circle." Samantha leaned against the kitchen island. "I wanted to say something. I didn't." "You didn't need to," Grace said, reaching for her hand. "You already did what he never could. You stayed." Samantha didn't cry. She just held her mother's hand, the way she had done when she was a child, grasping strength from the woman who built their world from nothing. In his hospital bed, Charles turned the name over in his mind. Samantha Bennett. He had known a Grace Bennett once. He had loved her, briefly, carelessly. He remembered her laughing, one night long ago, curled beside him in a too-small apartment, saying, "If I ever have a daughter, I'll name her Samantha." He hadn't thought of that memory in over 30 years. But now, in the quiet night, it returned like a ghost, and it stayed. Charles couldn't sleep that night. The hospital bed was too stiff, too sterile, despite the luxury of the private suite. The machines around him hummed softly, blinking their little lights in a rhythm that matched the throb of his own guilt, still unconscious, but slowly waking. Samantha. He whispered the name aloud. It rang too loudly in the stillness. It wasn't just the name of the young woman who had saved his life. It was the name. That name. The one Grace had said with a soft smile on a humid night so long ago, her legs curled beneath her, her eyes glowing with a kind of love that terrified him. If I ever have a daughter, I'd name her Samantha. It just feels right. At the time, he had laughed, had brushed it off. He hadn't realized he'd remember it. But now, alone with tubes in his veins and death narrowly escaped, he remembered everything. It had been decades, but the memory of Grace was still sharp in his mind. She was beautiful in a way that challenged expectation. Deep brown skin, confident hands, a laugh like something wild and clear. They met during a volunteer health program, back when he was young and still unsure of the world. She had been close to finishing medical school, bright, capable, full of plans. He hadn't intended to fall in love with her, but he had. She made him feel seen. Human. Like he could be more than the son of a wealthy family, the heir to a cold empire. With Grace, there was warmth. Hope. A vision of a different kind of life. But when she told him she was pregnant, everything changed. Suddenly, the fear crept in. His father's voice echoed in his head. The pressure of society. The shame he imagined they'd hurl at him. A black woman? A child out of wedlock? His inheritance, his respectability, everything would be at stake. So he did the cowardly thing. He paid. And walked away. 2 days later, Charles was in his hospital room when a nurse came in with a medication chart. She was new, young, chatty, kind. "You must be feeling better, sir," she said cheerfully. We were all so relieved. Dr. Samantha Bennett really held everything together. His breath caught. "She's one of the best we have," the nurse added, unaware of the storm she had triggered. "The director trained her herself. You know, Dr. Grace Bennett." He turned his face slowly toward her. "Grace Bennett?" he repeated, as if testing a ghost. The nurse blinked. "Yes, our hospital director. She's incredible. Used to be a doctor herself. Built all this from the ground up." The nurse left the room a moment later, but the silence she left behind was thick enough to drown in. Charles stared at the ceiling. Grace owned the hospital. Samantha was their daughter. The truth settled on him with crushing weight. They hadn't just moved on. They had risen. Without him. He requested to speak with Grace. At first, there was no reply. He waited a day, then another. Every time Samantha entered to check his vitals, she was cool and professional, never unkind, but distant. Unreachable. He wanted to say something. Anything. But shame sat like stone in his throat. Finally, on the 5th day, the door opened quietly. And there she was. Grace Bennett. Time had not dimmed her. She walked in without hesitation, wearing a slate blue suit that looked both medical and regal. Her presence filled the room like sunlight, warm and unbothered. She stood at the foot of the bed and met his eyes. He couldn't speak for a long moment. "Grace?" he whispered. She tilted her head slightly. "Charles?" Her voice held no tremble, no fury. Just grace. Ironic, he thought, given the name. "You built all this," he said, almost in awe, gesturing weakly around him. She nodded. "From scratch. While raising Samantha." He swallowed. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know." "I was afraid." "You were selfish," she corrected. He didn't argue. "I see her," he murmured. "In the way she walks. In her calm. That's you." "No," she said. "That's her. She became who she is in spite of what you did. I just stood beside her. I never stopped thinking about you," he tried. Grace gave a sad smile. "Yes, you did. Until your life was in her hands." He flinched. It was the truth. A raw, biting truth. "I want to be part of her life," he said quietly. "Somehow. Even if it's just a conversation." "She doesn't need a father now," Grace replied, her voice softer than before. "She needed one then. And you weren't there. Do you hate me?" "No," she said, almost kindly. Hating you would give you too much space in my heart. I just don't need you anymore. She stood there a moment longer, then turned to leave. Grace, he called. She paused at the door. I never deserved you, he said. She looked over her shoulder, her gaze piercing but calm. No, you didn't. Then she was gone. And the silence returned, more hollow than ever before. Charles remained in the hospital for another week, but it wasn't the heart monitor that kept him up at night. It wasn't the pain in his chest or the quiet ticking of the clock above his bed. It was the sound of a door closing. Grace had walked out of his room, and out of his reach, with more strength and dignity than he had remembered. And Samantha, she had walked past him every day with no hatred, no warmth, just silence. Her silence was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore felt completely exposed. Not as a tycoon. Not as a public figure. Just as a man. A man who had made a choice and now had to live with the wreckage of it. The day he was discharged, the sun was high and blinding. His driver stood by the car, ready to return him to the empire he had built. But he paused in the lobby of the hospital. There was a large plaque near the elevator, polished brass set in marble. Bennett Medical Center. Founded by Dr. Grace Bennett. Dedicated to resilience, healing, and legacy. Charles stared at it for a long time. There, carved in metal, was the proof of what Grace had done, what she had built, while he had been busy building stock portfolios and global influence. She hadn't just survived his betrayal. She had turned it into fuel. And the daughter he had abandoned? She had become the kind of doctor whose hands didn't tremble, even when faced with the man who had discarded her before she took her first breath. He didn't belong here. But he also didn't want to leave. So he made a decision. Samantha was in the administrative wing, finishing her rounds for the day, when a receptionist knocked gently at her office door. There's a Mr. Whitmore asking to speak with you. He said he'll wait. She hesitated. Everything in her wanted to say no. But a small part, buried under years of practiced strength, whispered, just this once. Hear him. She found him sitting outside on one of the hospital garden benches. It was quiet here. Flowers bloomed against the low walls. Patients sometimes came out for sunlight. Today, it was just him. He stood when he saw her. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't sit. I just wanted a few minutes, he said carefully. She nodded once. Speak. I have no right, he began. No right to ask you for anything. But I wanted you to know, what you did, what you've become, it humbles me. She said nothing. I used to think love was something I could afford to leave behind, he continued. That money could fix what I broke. I see now that I was wrong. Not just wrong, I was small. Cowardly. Samantha finally spoke, her voice cool and deliberate. I grew up wondering what kind of man would leave a woman like my mother. She was everything. And yet you chose silence. Money. Legacy. He winced, but didn't interrupt. I learned early that I could live without a father. But I made sure I would never live without self-respect. I know I can't fix anything, he said. But I'd give anything just to know you. To talk. Even if just once in a while. Samantha's eyes met his. You had a chance to be there. To be something. And you gave it up. You didn't just walk away from my mother. You walked away from me. From birthdays. From scraped knees. From graduations. Her voice caught slightly, then steadied again. You don't get to rewrite that story now just because you survived a heart attack. Charles lowered his head. I understand. She turned to leave but stopped after a few steps. I don't hate you, she said, without looking back. I just don't need you. And then she was gone. That evening, Charles sat alone in the backseat of his black car, staring out at the city that bore his name in buildings and contracts. But for the first time, none of it felt like home. He returned to his penthouse, glass walls, perfect furniture, a view of the skyline, and stood by the window, watching the sun dip behind distant rooftops. He picked up his phone more than once that night, scrolled through the numbers, thought of calling Grace, thought of calling Samantha, thought of saying something clever, something moving. But what could he say? What did a man say to the family he had thrown away? He had money, power, a name the world respected. But in the quiet hours of that long, cold night, he was just Charles. And Charles was alone. The years rolled on. Charles Whitmore remained in his world of influence, wealth, and solitude. He expanded his empire, cut more ribbons, shook more hands. His face still graced magazine covers and financial columns. People still spoke his name with admiration, respect, even envy. But when the crowds dispersed, and the speeches ended, and the lights dimmed, he returned to a home that echoed. He never saw Grace again. And Samantha never called. Every so often, he would hear about the hospital in the news, its innovations, its community outreach, a new wing dedicated to underprivileged mothers. Sometimes, Samantha would appear briefly in a clip, her white coat crisp, her expression calm and brilliant. And Charles would pause the screen, just to look. No one around him knew why the old man sometimes sat in silence, staring at a frozen image of a woman who didn't carry his name. He had once believed success was about what you could hold, what you could build, what the world applauded. But now, in the quiet corners of his life, he understood the truth. That legacy wasn't about buildings or companies. It was about the hearts you choose not to abandon, the hands you choose to hold, and the people who remember you, not for what you had, but for how you stayed. He learned the lesson too late, but he learned it all the same, and he lived with it. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Would also love to hear your thoughts on this story. Until next time, stay curious. Who knows what story we'll uncover next?